South Korea is collapsing. It seems like one of the most advanced societies in the world, but under the surface, there's a huge problem. The country has the lowest fertility rate globally of just 0.72 in 2023. This means that for every 100 women, there will be only 72 babies. The youngest generation is more than 60% smaller than the previous one, which will continue to get worse exponentially. The worst thing about it all is that fertility rates are only getting lower over time. As we'll go over in this video, this is causing some serious trouble in the nation. South Korean researchers are saying that this is an existential crisis because the nation won't be the same decades from now. But before we dive into this video, please hit that like button below. We can only make these videos with your guys' support. Without further ado, let's get into the basics. First of all, we should look at these demographic trends in more detail. In the past, South Korea used to have a booming population, just like many other Asian nations. Back in the 1960s, every woman in the country used to have 6 children on average. But as you can see on this chart, that the fertility rate fell like a brick. In 1983, a little over 20 years later, the fertility rate stood at just 2.1. This is called the replacement level, where the population stays relatively stable. By this point, the fertility rate collapse slowed down, but it wasn't exactly gone. With ups and downs, it went from 2.1 to 1.5 to 1.2, and eventually 2.7. In 2013, South Korea officially got the lowest fertility rate in the world, a title that it holds to this day. As you can imagine, it's not a title to be very proud of. Now, it's not the only country that's having fertility rate problems. On the contrary, the majority of countries globally have a fertility rate below the replacement level, and rates have gone down everywhere over the last decades. South Korea just happens to have the most extreme problems of them all. Weirdly enough, these low fertility rates haven't had their effect on the country's population size. Even with the new generations becoming smaller and smaller, South Korea's population has actually grown over the past decades. There's only one explanation for this, and that's an aging population. You can see this very clearly in South Korea's population pyramid. Well, it's supposed to look something like a pyramid, but South Korea's one looks nothing like it. The bulk of South Koreans' population is in the age range of 40 to 70, basically the boomer and X generations. That's because the birth rates were relatively high in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Also, due to vast improvements in healthcare, people simply get older. However, the discrepancy between the old and young generations is huge. For example, there are about 800,000 South Koreans aged 60, but only around 200,000 newborns. This imbalance creates a whole host of problems on its own, as we'll go over later. In the future, the actual population will inevitably begin to shrink dramatically. 2020 was the first year with more deaths than births. COVID obviously helped this quite a bit, but this population decline is not going to slow down. To understand this, we have to look at this chart. South Korea's total population has peaked in 2020, and it's now entering a slow but steady decline over the coming years. Currently, the country has 52 million people, which is expected to shrink to just 36 million people 50 years from now, or almost 40%. If we look real far away to the end of the 21st century, they're only going to have 27 million people according to the estimates. It's about half of the current population. Much of the country will become deserted. More than 1,000 small towns are already at risk of going extinct, and there will be more ghost towns if this trend continues. So now we understand that South Korea's population is starting to collapse. Of course, a collapsing population has enormous consequences for all aspects of society. You might think that having less people isn't that big of a problem. More space and resources per person seems like a great thing to have. But if the population collapse leads to an economic and social meltdown, well, then it's obviously not so great. And this is exactly why people are calling it an existential crisis. Also, for a nation technically at war, like South Korea is right now with North Korea, a population collapse is a huge risk factor. Surprisingly, there hasn't been a problem yet when we look at the economy. South Korea has one of the most impressive economies in the world, with a GDP of $1.7 trillion in 2023. Before the 2000s, the South Korean economy was on a tear, with growth regularly in the double digits. It has maintained pretty solid growth over the last 2 decades, with GDP growth rates regularly above the 3% mark. We could speculate that this slowdown in growth has to do with lower birth rates, but it could also just be because South Korea has become a developed country. And 3% a year is better than some of the country's peers are doing. South Korea has outperformed its peer Japan, as it's set to overtake its eastern neighbor in terms of GDP per capita this year. But with an impending population collapse, this solid level of economic growth may not be viable long term. To understand this, we have to look at the working age population of 15 to 64 years old. They're responsible for most of the consumption, and of course, they are the ones generating an income. This group is going to shrink even more dramatically than the general population because of a demographic shift to the 65 and older category. Right now, South Korea has 36 million working age people, which is expected to go down to just 16 million 50 years from now. Yeah, you heard that right. It's going to more than halve. Because of this, the country's economy could run into a wall. If it has less than half the working population, it needs to double incomes just to maintain its size. While this is more than achievable in 50 years due to advancements in tech, the real problem lies in international competitiveness. There's a real risk that countries with healthier demographics will get ahead of South Korea in the long term. Candidates are nations like Vietnam, Indonesia, or India. After all, intense labor shortages aren't great for attracting businesses and investment. On top of that, if South Korea falls in the economic rankings, it's going to lose tons of its international influence. The only consolation for the government in Seoul is that other countries are also struggling with birth rates, so it won't be the only one experiencing a stagnation. On top of that, the South Korean government has enough to worry about with the age dependency disaster waiting to happen. There will be too many elderly and not enough working-age adults in the country. The main problems have to do with pensions and healthcare. Like many other countries, the government in South Korea has set up a pay-as-you-go pension system. Basically, the people working now are supposed to pay the money for the people currently retired. It was set up this way in the 1980s, which was a huge mistake in hindsight. It works seamlessly if there are fewer retirees than working people, because the working population is able to support the retirees with just a fraction of their income. But right now, the working population is rapidly shrinking, and the 65 and older population is rapidly growing. This shows in the age-old dependency ratio, which shows how many people there are to support the elderly. Back in the 1960s, there were nearly 20 people working for every retiree. In 2024, this number is down to 4. A little over a decade from now, South Korea will only have 2 people to support every retiree. And around 2070, the number of elderly is expected to surpass the amount of working-age citizens. That could be disastrous. How can just one individual pay for somebody else's pension? The South Korean government realized that this issue was bound to come back up when fertility rates fell below the replacement level. That's why it created a national pension fund to act as a buffer. Right now, South Korea has $860 billion set aside in investments to cover future pensions expenses. This is actually the 3rd largest national investment portfolio globally, which is a pretty big deal considering South Korea's size. But it won't be enough. By 2041, payments will start to outpace contributions. And in 2055, the fund is expected to be depleted. The South Korean president pledged to reform the fund. But there are no pretty solutions. He'll either cut people's pensions or force people to pay more contributions. Because of the political reality, there's also a chance that the problem gets delayed. It's more popular to turn to national debt, creating an even bigger crisis for decades from now. The pension system isn't the only part of society that's at risk of breaking down. Now, recently, we crossed 1 million subscribers. Ever since then, we've been flooded with emails asking us questions and advice about growing a channel here on YouTube. Even though we try our best to reply to every single email, sometimes these take up too much time or they ask the same question we've answered 1,000 times before. That's why we've decided to put all of our YouTube advice into one email bootcamp for completely free. So, if you're someone who's interested in starting your own YouTube channel, you can get your email bootcamp by clicking on the link in the description or by scanning the QR code that's on the screen. Elderly people need a lot of healthcare support, which is hard to provide for if there are not enough people to pay taxes and work in hospitals. The concerning part is that the healthcare system is already in a crisis right now. A few months ago, South Korea deployed army doctors to hospital emergency rooms. The crazy part is that this wasn't because of a public health crisis like COVID. It's just because there are too many old people and not enough doctors. Some emergency rooms in the country had to turn patients away because of these issues. Several physicians warned that the hospital emergency system is at the verge of collapse, although the South Korean government denies this. Even if it's not yet collapsing right now, it could very well do so in the future. We all know that the aging pressure is going to get multiple times worse. When we're talking about pressure on South Korean society, we should also mention North Korea. The two are technically nations at war, because the Korean War from 1950 to 1953 ended in an armistice agreement. A peace treaty was never actually signed. Now you might ask, what does this have to do with the population collapse? Well, the best thing preventing an attack from the North Korean side is a strong and respectable military. The demographic collapse could undermine this. In order to keep its defenses in order, the South Korean military needs a lot of personnel, which it is increasingly struggling to hire. Right now, the country has 480,000 military personnel, the lowest number ever. In 50 years' time, the amount of people eligible for military service will have shrunk by 58%. By 2038, the size of the country's armed forces will probably fall below the 400,000 mark. For comparison, the North Korean military has about 1.14 million soldiers. Now, maybe warfare will get a whole lot more automated and machine-based, but South Korea's military planners are definitely worrying about this. Another thing they're worrying about is securing a big enough budget. The country's defense budget is on the rise in nominal terms, but as a percentage of GDP, it's going down. The risk is that when the government budget becomes really tight, the investment into military will stagnate or even go down. This could happen because of a lower tax revenue with less people working, or because of higher spending on pensions and healthcare. These things can squeeze the military's funding, with, well, dangerous outcomes. So the population collapse will affect South Korea's society on all fronts, whether it be the economy, social security, and national security. With all these problems, there's also the risk of conflicts within the society. Every age group has its own interests, but they can't all get their way. For the old people to get their pensions and healthcare, the younger and middle-aged citizens need to pay more taxes. South Korea is a democracy, so the older population likely gets to decide most of the policy as they're simply in the majority. If this goes wrong, there will be a lot of anger built up within the younger generations who have it way more difficult than the older people had it. A lack of social harmony is obviously a big risk. Now that we understand how serious the situation really is, we need to dig a little bit deeper. The elephant in the room is why this demographic collapse is happening in the first place. As a bit of a disclaimer, demographics are incredibly complex, and there are many ways you can look at this. If you have other theories or even personal experience, please let us know down in the comments. But one of the most sound theories out there has to do with urbanization. This chart, showing the percentage of South Koreans living in cities, explains a lot. Over time, the vast majority of South Koreans moved into the cities, which began all the way back in the 1960s. Then, just 28% of the population lived in urban areas. Now, that's a whopping 81%. You can't help but notice that this chart is exactly the inverse of the one showing fertility rates. The effect of urbanization on fertility rates is obvious when we look at the Seoul metropolitan area, where nearly half of the country's population lives. Unsurprisingly, the birth rates in the capital is just 0.55, way below the national average. It's always been this way in big cities, historically speaking. The problem is that people keep moving into the big cities because of the better economic opportunities and access to services. While it's easier to get a job in the metropolitan area, it's way harder to start a family there. In an urban environment, people live in pretty crowded areas. In turn, they're more stressed and busy than elsewhere. Also, if you think about this in an evolutionary way, people could be hardwired to want fewer children if they live in a dense space where resources seem scarce. Another part of the decision happens very consciously, as South Koreans in the capital city are confronted with the huge cost of living. If you want to buy a detached house in Seoul, you need about 1.1 billion South Korean won, which comes down to about $1 million US. For comparison, people in Seoul earn about 50 million won a year on average, which equates to less than 40,000 US dollars per year. This relates to another cause of the demographic problem, namely the cost of living crisis. The huge gap between income and house prices, especially in the Seoul metropolis, is one of the main reasons why people can't start a family. The housing prices in the country doubled over the last 20 years, far outpacing wages. This resulted in a household debt going through the roof. Household debt alone is about 102% of GDP. In the US, it's only 63%. So, starting a family in urban South Korea inevitably means that you'll end up in a lot of debt, which is why a lot of people simply choose not to. This financial problem only worsened over the last years because of stagnating wages. Over the last 20 years in South Korea, real wages adjusted for inflation increased only 27%. This might seem like a lot, but historically speaking, it's peanuts. In the 1980s, real wages regularly grew at 10% a year. In the 1990s, the growth in real income was still around 5% year on year. It's safe to say that this age of rapidly growing prosperity is over in South Korea. This hurts the young generation the most because they never benefited from huge economic growth. But it can't just be a financial problem. Over the last 20 years, the South Korean government has spent $286 billion to create financial incentives for having children. Parents get monthly subsidies, subsidized housing, and their healthcare costs are also covered. This only increased over the years, with the monthly subsidy increasing from about $230 to a planned $765 per month. The parental leave is also going up from 1 year to 1.5 years, which is partially funded by the government. All in all, South Korean parents get some of the best support globally, according to UNICEF. Clearly, this hasn't worked yet, as birth rates have only declined. As this chart shows, higher government support didn't change the course of fertility rates at all. Either the financial incentives are not big enough, or there are some other problems. The South Korean birth rates would definitely go up if the government spends even more than tens of billions of dollars per year on financial incentives. But that's not all too realistic for an economy of $1.6 trillion. Perhaps it's more reasonable to fix some of the other underlying issues. One of these other problems has to do with cultural issues in South Korea. The country's president acknowledged that the demographic crisis can't be solved by spending, and that the country is excessively and unnecessarily competitive. This is a worse issue than you might think. People in South Korea overwork a lot, which has become the cultural norm. It's one of the hardest working countries on Earth, with on average 1,901 hours worked in 2022. A 9-to-6 contract is very common, which doesn't even include the extra hours. The legal limit is actually 69 hours of work per week, which is a 9-to-8 with no breaks for 6 days a week. You would obviously think that no one in their right mind would do this, but South Korea is incredibly competitive. For a lot of people, their status and self-worth depends on how much they contribute in the office. Many of them sacrifice their free time and even their sleep to get ahead in the labor market. In South Korea, there are actually sleep cafes for people to take a power nap during their lunch break, so that they have the energy to work until late into the evening. This problem of overworking is often linked to suicidality, as South Korea has the 4th highest suicide rate globally, and the highest one among developed countries. The country has a mental health crisis, as 7 out of 10 Koreans reported mental health problems last year. If the working culture is so demanding, well, no wonder South Koreans are not starting families. The hyper-competitive culture also makes it very difficult to raise children in the country. It's the cultural norm in South Korea to send your children to extracurricular classes and private schools. From the age of 4, they get extra education in English, math, sports, and the like. This definitely has some upsides, as the country is one of the most highly educated in the world, but there's also a huge downside, and that's the fact that South Korea is the most expensive country in the world to raise a child. Parents are afraid that if their kid doesn't go to these private schools, they're being set up for failure, which is why 98% of them pay for private tuition. This is called the golden ticket syndrome, where people believe you can only succeed in life with a prestigious education. But most people can barely afford these private classes because they cost hundreds of dollars per month per child. So instead, they won't have children at all, or maybe only one. People in the middle income category rather invest in one child than two, as they believe it's smarter to put all your eggs in one basket. It also deserves to be mentioned that South Korea is not really a great place for children. Students study 12 or more hours per day because they go to regular classes, but then they also attend these special private schools in the evening. One Korean woman told a news agency that Korea is not a place where children can live happily. And if you had a childhood like this, perhaps you're not very excited about raising your own kids. Another huge factor worth discussing is the changing social norms in South Korea, and frankly all over the world. With the rise of feminism and liberal values, starting a family has become less of a priority. Many South Korean women want to pursue a career and have financial freedom. In South Korea, this is very hard to combine with starting a family because of the work culture, which has stayed conservative. When South Korean women get a baby, they usually have to quit their job or give up on their career ambitions. This is a major reason why most of the highly educated women opt out of having kids. It's already very hard for South Korean women to have a good career, because the country has the highest gender pay gap of any OECD developed country. This issue is pretty divisive in Korea, by the way, with the president recently abolishing the Ministry of Gender Equality, saying that the government should focus on broader demographics and social problems. A part of this is that there are also issues for South Korean men. They're still expected to have enough income to provide for their future family, even though there's now a lot of competition in the job market. As a result, a lot of South Korean men are giving up. Nearly 500,000 of the country's young adults are not employed in education or in training, and the vast majority of them are males. Because of these societal problems and the huge pressure to have a successful career, many young Koreans stay single. The majority of Koreans aged 20 to 44 are not in a relationship. 51% of men and 64% of women in the category said they wanted to remain so. If people are not dating, well, they're not marrying either. This is clearer when we look at the marriage statistics. The number of new marriages is hitting record lows, with less than 200,000 of them in 2023. This is less than half of the new marriages registered in 1983. In the span of just a decade, the marriage rate in South Korea has fallen by 40%, so it's mostly the newer generations having problems. In a survey, only 1/3 of them have positive views on getting married. The main reason they have named for not wanting to get married had to do with money. Apart from people not getting married, there are also not a lot of babies born outside of marriage. It turns out that this is a pretty huge factor for the low birth rates. In 2020, just 2.5% of babies were born out of wedlock in South Korea. This was 40.5% in the US that same year. The reason has to do with strict cultural norms in South Korea. In terms of social stability, having few births out of wedlock might be a good thing, but it's certainly not helping with the demographics problem. So it's clear that there are many aspects of the culture in South Korea leading to low birth rates. What made the demographic problem even worse is that South Korea decided not to allow mass migration, unlike other developed countries. There are certainly many arguments for not allowing too many immigrants into the country, but it doesn't help with the population crisis. Many European nations have reduced their demographic problems by attracting people from less prosperous areas. Because of political and cultural reasons, South Korea's current net migration rate is only 0.4, meaning that it takes in about 4 migrants a year for every 10,000 people. The country could attract a lot more migrants because of its relatively high prosperity. In the US, the net migration rate is 2.8, so it takes in 28 people a year for every 10,000 citizens, or maybe even more if we take into account illegal immigration. Even though the net migration rate is pretty low, South Korea has quite a sizable foreign-born population of 2.5 million as of 2023. The group is on the rise, but it's not enough to fix the birth rate issue. South Korea is in some aspects a very conservative society, and the government doesn't want too many foreigners in order to preserve their culture. People moving there need to be proficient in South Korean and prove you have a way of earning a good income. Ending on a positive note, there are some potential solutions to the problem. The country's president is going to create a ministry to combat the demographic crisis. He stated that, "We will mobilize all of the nation's capabilities to overcome the low birth rate, which can be considered a national emergency." We don't know exactly what he's going to do, but we can take some guesses. Incentivizing people to live in less crowded areas would go a long way, especially if businesses could be motivated to move there as well. Right now, the South Korean population is divided incredibly unevenly, with huge differences between cities and the countryside. When we look at the population density, there are a lot of relatively empty areas and smaller towns. Getting a more even population density would help with making living spaces less cramped and hopefully improve birth rates. Also, the ministry could do something about the cultural issues. Tougher rules on overworking would give people more time and energy for raising a family. The government in South Korea could also open up the door for more immigration. A former justice minister recently said that the time for worrying about whether or not to proceed with a new immigration policy has passed. If we do not proceed, we will inevitably face a crisis of national extinction due to population decline. If the country allows in more immigrants, they will probably come from Southeast Asia. This region has cultural similarities with South Korea, but it has more people and there are less economic opportunities. Probably the new ministry will also create some extra financial incentives for having babies. Historically, they've not been as effective, but because the cost of living problem is so big, the financial side can't be ignored. Businesses are also stepping in. Some of them are providing unique incentives to their employees, with one company giving away up to $100,000 to employees who are expecting a child. The government is also incentivizing this with tax benefits for the companies. But that's not the only thing motivating them. If you're a businessman in South Korea, you're probably getting worried about how to hire future employees if the birth rates stay so low. Without people, all their investments become worthless. However, these policies of business and the government are probably not going to get the fertility rate back to 2.1. Hopefully for South Korea, that might not be as big of a deal because of AI. With this new technology, the gap of working-age people is cut. Businesses will need to hire less employees for the same amount of work because of huge productivity gains. Also, retirees can get the goods and services they need if there's increased automation. Maybe South Korea will be one of the first countries to implement robots on a mass scale. It's already the country with the most robots in manufacturing and one of the most developed robotics industries. Robots could replace a lot of the typical physical tasks of human workers. All of this is to say that the demographic crisis might not be the end of the world for South Korea. but the population collapse is certainly the biggest issue the country faces right now. Apart from the Rocket Man dictator across the border, perhaps.